Hey, this is Ramon. The channel is Alpha 4, and I have several working titles for this video. There is Alpha 4 takes on Logicked. Logicked trees. Truth trees. It's a logic joke. Get it? Or Symbolicked Logicked. Huh? Yeah, they're all lame. Anyway, so I'm going to be making a response video to a video Logic just put out on a guy called the Righteous Judge. Now, just to be clear, almost everything the Righteous Judge said was nonsense. The guy's a loon. But a lot of the comments that Logicked made on those comments were actually very interesting. Now, he said he was wearing kid gloves, but believe it or not, by taking out some of the sarcasm, he made some more cogent points and asked some more traditional religious questions. I say that because they're more traditional, I'm actually familiar with those questions and I have answers. I know you've been stuck in hell for a very long time. I'm very sorry about that. You kind of went right past purgatory and got stuck in hell. I'm assuming you're still alive, so I'm just going to say, talking to Christians might be a way to get out. Now, as far as I know, according to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, once you're in hell, you never get out. Sorry. But that being said, there was this whole thing with Jesus where he died and went in and took all the people in the place, and sometimes they call it limbo, but other people call it like outer hell. Just to let you know, I did invite Bad Tempered on. He's going to be having me on his channel for something, and we've been trying to work out some sketches, but because my personal life has been kind of a mess, I haven't been able to get him on Discord to do any videos with him, but he will be returning for those of you who like seeing a badger on this channel. Anyway, let's get into Logick's questions to the Righteous Judge.
Born-again Christians are born again, and them being Jesus is it? Or does there just need to be an explanation for you specifically being born again, but not for other people, and so those people's born-againness doesn't require the explanation of Jesusism? Man, these rules are so confusing.
Logicked. Multiple Jesus. Multiple little tiny Jesuses, right? Well, believe it or not, even though this guy's saying something almost nonsensical, there is actually a theological root to this idea. That is, in Eastern Orthodox Catholicism, in Christian mysticism, the goal is actually theosis. That is, to become God. Now, that does not mean that we each become individual tiny gods like in the Mormon theology. No. What it actually means is that we want to go back to the source from which we came. We want to become one in body, because what's going on here is that we all consider ourselves to be part of the body of Christ. That means part of the mystical body of Jesus. And another aspect to that, as I said, theosis, is that we should strive to become one in will and in body with Christ. So that's body, soul, and mind, to be one with God. Is that 620?
Huh. You know, for a second there, I almost wasn't convinced. I was thinking stupid stuff, like the mere fact that multicellular organisms require their cells to function together to survive doesn't tell you anything about either the origin of life or the history of life on Earth. At least not all by its lonesome, like you presented it. All you did was mention it. You didn't even try to explain why it implies a conscious designer as opposed to unconscious, it survived so it's here development via evolution, or for that matter any other idea that's ever been put forth. And then after making no argument, you told me the answer is clear. And as I said, I wasn't the most convinced.
Alright, so complexity and irreducible simplicity are two terms that most well-rounded apologists like to throw around when they get put in a linguistic corner while debating, let's say, non-believers, and even sometimes when debating each other, when it comes to the nature of God. But even though you just used his nonsensical statement as a way to make a pun, there's actually something there when it comes to the understanding of God. Basically, it goes like this. See, the problem comes with the fact that Protestants have divorced themselves and tried to distance themselves because of their commitment to things like sola scriptura. So because of that, they've rejected philosophy and science as being too Catholic. And that might sound silly to someone like you who thinks even Catholics are crazy, but that's actually what's going on within those two branches of Christianity. That is the tension between them. Because of that, the arguments that a lot of American or English-speaking atheists and atheist apologists, if you don't mind being called that, make are kind of lackluster, because you're all aiming at the Protestant idea of sola scriptura. You're not really going after any Catholic ideas. And that's led me to wonder, in countries that are majority Catholic, how do they argue against Catholicism? I'm actually truly curious about that, because Catholics don't reject science. They don't reject philosophy. Now, we do add some things to that mix. We add in metaphysics, we add in dogma, and we add in tradition. So we're a little bit more accepting, hence the term Catholic.
If you hand me a coin and you tell me it's gold, and I test it and I find out that it's copper, I've proven the negative. The coin is not gold. Or at least it's proven to the degree people usually mean when they talk about proving a fact about the world, whether negative or positive, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. The difficulty with proving a negative to that level comes in when the person making the claim attempts to retreat to an unfalsifiable position.
And then we get to 927 in your video.
Your threshold for what constitutes a reasonable doubt has been pushed so far that there's no way for me to prove anything beyond it. Your claim has become unfalsifiable. And over the years, theists have been doing this more and more with their gods. You can't detect this god with any of the senses unless you put the cart before the horse and believe it first, of course. No instrument can detect it. It's not even in the universe, so nothing in the universe can detect it. But there's one critical flaw, which is that theists, yourself included, still love to make what they think are logical arguments for God's existence by showing how it's consistent with this or that feature of reality. Take, for example, your half an argument. Multicellular organisms are complex, and only an intelligent designer is consistent with complexity, therefore God. Or however you would rather I phrase it.
Alright, Logicked. Okay, so here's the thing. I don't really like your over the years comment. Specifically because it's just simply not true. If you go back to the original church fathers, that is the Christian writers of the 1st and 2nd century, they already had an idea of an incorporeal and mysterious God. In fact, if you even go back to the early Jewish writings, what they sometimes call Jewish thought, you can already see the development. This is extra biblical, by the way, meaning outside of the Bible. They already had the ideas of an incorporeal and mysterious God. When I say mysterious, and I think that word needs to be clarified just a little bit. For the sake of arguing with an atheist, or for the sake of a atheist perspective, you can take mysterious to mean unknowable. But from a believer's perspective, mysterious here means knowable only through faith. And for us, that is tied into grace. In other words, God has to tell us first, and then we can know it. I know what you're going to say to that, but I'm just telling you what that is.
Well, if you think the consistency of God's proposed traits with himself or with the world can be determined via logical arguments, which then function as proof of his existence, maybe you also think their inconsistency can be argued for that way as well, and those arguments can function as proof of his non-existence. If you want to be consistent, you should. And this form of disproof doesn't require God to be visible at all.
As for the arguments for God's existence being limited to human knowledge and experience, buddy, that's all we got. But that's the truth for anyone, even for you. Even if you were trying to explain evolution or a mathematical theorem, you're limited in the scope of knowledge you can possess, limited by time and by circumstance. Hence, people like me who, while I have personal experiences that help me understand my faith, the truth is that I also rely on writings, specifically ancient writings. And just like you rely on textbooks for your information and source books for your knowledge on science and technology, the same goes for those who are into theological and philosophical argumentation. When we explore these things, we go to experts who then tell us which books or writings are relevant to our field of study. This is the same thing you do when you go to school or go to college, and we have a thing called seminary, and in college we have a thing called philosophy, which is also the origin of universities, comes from Aristotle and Plato and all that good stuff. It's the same, okay? From linguistics to theology, these are all branches of philosophy. And you might not like that. You might not like that, for instance, a lot of math comes originally from a religious cult with Pythagoras. You might not like that fact. You might not like the fact that modern science and medicine gets a lot of its current understanding from alchemy. You might not like that, but it was a necessary step to get to the next step. Now, when you go to school, you don't read all the crazy ideas of the Middle Ages about, demons and spirits embodying healing energy into a type of root. What you do is you see that, okay, so when we tested these things, that to test these types of roots, these healing roots and healing herbs out, it turns out these herbs did nothing. They were just additives and made it taste better. But these herbs over here were actually effective. And now we have Tylenol and we have aspirin. But there were necessary steps to get there, and you just cut away the stuff that ends up being false. Well, what happens in theology is that you put things through logical arguments, symbolic logic, truth trees, and the ontological argument, as you like to point out. And what you do is you see which one of these holds true according to logic. That means that they are consistent within themselves. That does not mean that they are absolutely true or absolutely false. That just means that within the structure of their argumentation, it is structurally consistent. And then from there, you start arguing over the truth claims, and then you try to build on that. This is the same for all learning. It's the same process. So you're being a little bit inconsistent here by trying to shit on someone for, admittedly, this guy's an idiot, but aside from that you're trying to shit on someone for using a process that you yourself have to use, because we all have to use this process, and you know that. There's also something else in your "it's changed over the years" comment that bothers me, which is that in all three major branches of the Abrahamic faith, there are some consistent conclusions. That is, that God exists outside of time, that God is unseeable or mysterious or unknowable through mortal eyes, that it takes faith and grace to understand, that God is real, that God has a will. All these things are conclusions that have come forth through multiple religions. These conclusions have been reached dating back millennia. You're talking 4,000 years of theological and philosophical thought where these truths have been reached. And they would give you book and verse of where you can see these references in the Bible, but I think you'd find that condescending. So I'll just say this. Read the Bible, anything after Exodus and before, I'm going to say, the New Testament. Just read that and you can see these conclusions being reached in the Bible itself. Also, I would personally recommend reading the Church Fathers. And for someone like you who seems to be able to do a good amount of research, I'd recommend reading the Divine Office, because the Divine Office has readings that directly reflect and talk about these concepts. And like I said, we're talking about Church Fathers from before the Bible was written, when the Bible was written, at the first councils, all of that stuff in the 1st and 2nd century, explaining these concepts of God and God's nature and God's relation to man and man's relation to God, and God existing outside of time, and God being incorporeal, and Jesus representing God in interactions with man. Like, all those ideas are there. That being said, I'd also recommend you read the Jewish thought on these concepts. So I'd recommend the Talmud. I'd recommend the Midrash, because you can see from a Jewish perspective these same conclusions being reached. Now, What about Islam? Well, the only thing I could tell you to read would be the Tafsir and the Hadith. With Islam, you have to read a lot of Hadith. And a problem with that is that much of the Hadith has not been translated into English, so you'd have a really hard time finding that stuff. Now we're at 11:15.
Intention here then, that when a Christian's argument is called a God of the Gaps argument, it never is, or at least rarely is. Because, like it or not, Christians do have a bad habit of trying to jam God into plain old knowledge gaps when there's no indication that he really fits there. If you want an example, how about that one video of yours I looked at earlier? How are multicellular organisms so complex? Therefore God. That's the basic argument you presented. If there was supposed to be anything more to it than there's a gap in my knowledge, so only God can fit there, you didn't present it.
I'll be honest with you. I don't really like or even enjoy hearing the God of the Gaps or the Divine Watchmaker arguments being made. But, to be really honest, I never even heard those arguments until I started watching skeptic content on YouTube. And I only heard it on skeptic channels when that particular skeptic or atheist would make an argument against their straw man version of that argument on his or her channel. And that was only a few years ago. So I've been Catholic and Christian my entire life. Yes, I did read other religions. Yes, I was a lapsed Catholic for a while. But I've always believed in God, and I've never heard any of those God of the Gaps or Divine Watchmaker arguments said by a Christian or Catholic apologist. That is until recently, as in the last few months, heard Dr. Michael Brown make his argument against atheism, where he did use a Divine Watchmaker argument. And I believe Ken Ham also does something like that, but as a Catholic, I'm not really exposed to things that Ken Ham says, so whatever. That being said, I am not going to simply say, oh, Catholics never make it, because after I saw the Michael Brown debate, I then saw on Catholic Answers when atheists would call in to ask about this topic, they would start using Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs argument to prove the case for God's existence. So yes, Thomas Aquinas does have the 5 proofs argument. That's where traditionally people give credit for that argumentation, or for the first formalization of that argumentation. So that is a Catholic argumentation. But like I said, I didn't grow up hearing it. I don't know anyone who grew up hearing it. I live in a predominantly Catholic community, and I've never heard these arguments being made ever growing up. It wasn't part of my religious education to hear those formalizations for the existence of God. It would be something like a miracle would be a proof, something amazing happening, the beauty of the universe, that kind of stuff. And not as an, oh, we don't understand, but it would be more like, here's how science works. Here's how genes work. Here's how evolution works. Isn't that beautiful? Look at this amazing thing that God created. Look at the things that you understand and see how beautiful it is. That's God's handiwork, that kind of thing. And then when it would come to the miracle stuff, it would be not you don't understand, it would be something that you do understand, and then things working out for the best and being like, okay, so you see guardian angels are real, that kind of thing. So you go driving on a highway, you get to a place where the bridge collapsed, you swerve and you somehow hit a plank of wood and you survive. I'm saying this because it's happened to me and 3 of my friends. And then cars behind you see you do that and they swerve also. And the next day you see barriers that say don't cross, construction, all that kind of stuff, because there's a gap in the highway. Those kind of miracles are things that we look at as proof of God. That's not something that we don't understand. We understand there's coincidence at play and chance. But we view that as that momentary realization of what to do before you can consciously make a decision as God looking out for us. For instance, I don't usually talk about this on here, but as a kid, I got jumped by, I think, 3 people or 4 people. And I was a real skinny kid, and I was a real wimpy guy, and they killed me. They hit me here in my throat, close off my throat. It bashed my head against a metal beam, and my heart stopped for a minute. When I woke up in the hospital, the doctor explained to me what happened. I told him I had an out-of-body experience. He said that was quite normal, that everybody has them, or most people have them. These kind of things we equate to an understanding of faith, to a religious experience, stuff like that. And you don't have to go that dramatic. You know, some people it's, oh, they prayed for a parking space. You know, some people it's, I'll do this thing if this other thing happens, and you know, that kind of stuff. So it's not a God of the gaps argument for most people. Most people, it's miracles, and it's not even big miracles. It's little miracles that convince people that their beliefs are correct. And of course, you can do the correlation argument that when you stop at a stoplight and you say, turn green, and it turns green, that's not really you doing it. Yeah, you can make that argument. And I'm not denying that you can't make that argument. I'm saying that for those of us who believe, this is our version of confirmation bias, but it's not confirmation bias in a, oh, we don't understand nature kind of way. No, it's, I understand that the sky is beautiful because the sun is reflecting through the ozone, and it's reflecting off of water and causing the clouds or the moisture in the atmosphere to change the color of the clouds. And that's beautiful. And look at this beautiful thing that God made. Okay. I understand that the human body is incredibly beautiful and functional and works. That is beautiful. Okay. So it's an argument from beauty. It's not an argument from lack of understanding. On the other hand, the argument from miracle, but it's not as if we don't understand coincidence, that was set up days before, years ago, and just it happened to work out that we hit the right spot to have this thing happen. But we still thank God for those things. Then we get to 1330.
Oh, I know what your goofy definition of perfectness is now, sure. But now you're telling me you're not only defining God as perfect, but as perfectness itself. I know what it would mean for something to be perfect. Humans come up with some standard of what we think the best version of a thing would look like, based on what we think is better and worse. And if the thing matches exactly to our standard, if we decide it's complete by conforming to every part of the standard, if we think it's flawless by not deviating from the standard, if we think it serves whatever purpose we assign to it without fault, then we call it perfect.
No, that's not what Christians or Catholics, even most people of any faith, mean by perfect. For most Christians, God is considered to be love and truth. That is perfect love and absolute truth. And while you might argue, well, what does that mean? Or you might question, what does that mean? Basically, what it is that for us, that is an actual theological theory about the understanding of God's nature, or the understanding of what God represents to us in a practical sense. Just to be clear, the argument that the divine judge made here, or whatever he calls himself, was not a good argument. But that doesn't mean he wasn't hitting on a legitimate theological theory that exists inside religious thought.
The perfection of the thing is as subjective as moral goodness or badness, for example, because although the thing can be objectively compared precisely to the standard itself was made up by us in the first place. What counts as better or worse is fundamentally arbitrary and based on human preference. Just like how the basic goals that we build our moral rules upon came from us, even if certain actions objectively help or hinder us in the achievement of those goals.
So, when it comes to God, calling him a being can get problematic linguistically, as we don't believe God was created. We consider him the Alpha and Omega, that is the ultimate source and progenitor of creation, as well as its ultimate judge and its destroyer. That last part is important to your objection. See, as Christians specifically believe that God is the moral standard. That is, if he does something, that automatically makes it right, meaning morally correct. We, as individuals, as humans, can disagree among ourselves and have our own reasons, justifications, and morality. But ultimately, it is he who is the arbiter of right and wrong, not we, but he. And just to give an example of this, I just watched a very boring debate where a Muslim apologist named Muhammad Hijab made this very point. And it was one of the few, very few, cogent points he made during that whole debate. Now, I understand that you're saying you as an atheist disagree with some of the choices that God makes. That's your right as a human to do, correct? And you as an atheist disagree with the moral conclusions that is promoted by religious institutions such as different Christian communities. Again, as you're human, that is your right. In the Bible itself, it says you have this power, this free will to do so. I'm not arguing against that. Yeah, I believe in free will. I know some atheists don't, but I do. I know some religious people don't, namely Calvinists. But again, I do believe in free will. So I'm not arguing against that concept. I'm simply saying that God is the ultimate judge of morality.
It'd be like looking at my glasses and saying that their colors are redness and blueness.
Well, you're right that redness, blueness, purpleness, blackness, brownness is subjective and relative. The truth is that from a humanistic point of view, all morality is subjective and relativistic. And that makes the humanistic point of view ultimately irrelevant, as it changes over time and by circumstance. For instance, the social political morality of the 1980s would be almost completely incompatible with the social political morality of the current year, as you can ask any SJW. The reason why you need an outside objective truth is, as the Old Testament has it, you need a shekel in the sanctuary, an unchanging external measure by which to set our values by. Unchanging being a key component to that equation. And before you say, yeah, but the Old Testament seems different than the New Testament, the Catholic answer to that is very simple, which I'm sure you've heard before, and that is God doesn't change, our understanding of God changes. Then we get to 1538.
And what in the definition of the word perfect means something is necessarily more perfect than nothing? Is there some objective law that transcends God that dictates the superiority of having more power to having less, or of knowing more to knowing less, or of being more morally good, whatever that might mean to you, to being less good, or of some particular thing existing to it not existing? Maybe you'll say, yes, God is bound by these rules.
So it's not that God's bound by any rules that he doesn't create himself. Everybody knows the expression, God can do anything. Through God, all things are possible. What I'm actually going to say to you here is more of a philosophical argument, which is that there is a well-known, very basic philosophical list. And it's a list of goods and a list of things that are better than. And it is very unsophisticated by its very nature. It's meant to be an introductory lesson into most philosophy classes. And it goes like this. Life is better than death. Hope is better than despair. Peace is better than war. And health is better than illness. Now, there are more dichotomies to this list. I'm just going based off what I remember from my Intro to Phil class, and that was a very long time ago. Well, it's true that people like Foucault and people like Saltaire will disagree. That does not mean that this list is irrelevant or null or void. I think it's a very true list, and I think it's sad that a lot of people don't recognize those universal truths and they fall into nihilism. Now we're at 1920.
It's exactly what the ontological argument does with God. I'd say it's not compelling at all, but close enough. If it's not compelling, what's notable about it? Well, again, you leave your thought process unstated, so I guess who cares?
So I disagree with your dismissiveness of the ontological argument. While you are correct that if you change the set values, the exact same formula can be used to prove that there is no God, that you have to do that, you have to change the set values. The ontological argument, the way that it's set up, proves that there is the existence of an ultimate being, or a perfect being if you want to use those words. But this is a well-known and well-established philosophical formula that is very hard to solve and has never been disproven. And to call it madness just because you don't like its conclusion just comes off as rude, pedantic, and a little bit below your intellect, because you clearly have a sharp wit. There's no reason for you to be so dismissive of something just because you don't simply like it. Now we're at 2107.
However, this video seems directed more at Christians who believe there's a hell, so you're probably just trying to start from a position you think they already agree with, which, even if I find it questionable, is at least a strategy I can understand.
Alright, so when it comes to hell, I would say that I made my own video talking about hell. And if any particular YouTube skeptic who happens to have a sharp sense of humor would want to do a video about it, you know, they could. Nudge, nudge. You know? Right. I'm going to close out by saying I don't currently monetize this channel, but I do support free speech, and I do support open debate. Anyone who agrees with me that we should have free speech and open debate, feel free to go to Logick's Patreon and make a donation there for him so that he can continue on. If you like me and you like him and I'm a Catholic and he's an atheist and you like seeing open debate, everyone's got to eat, man. So feel free to go over to his Patreon and support him if you really want to. Otherwise, peace, like, and subscribe. I will talk to you all later. This has been fun. I hope to do this again, and you all have a good night.